My name is Perry Brown. I'm the Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University, and welcome to the Provost Distinguished Lecture Series, the first lecture for this semester. And what we do in this lecture series is we watch the year before to see who's winning awards, whose books maybe are winning awards, and things like that. And then we try to make a selection of a variety of speakers, faculty members who can share with you that are truly people that are in the limelight, that are getting recognition usually nationally and sometimes internationally. And so besides this talk tonight, we have a talk in November, on November 13th, by Alan Sillers from the Communication Studies Department, and he's going to be talking about miscommunication and misperception and family conflicts. And he's been doing research in that area for about 30 years and is an international leader in that particular field. And so Alan will be on November 13th. And then on December 2nd, Joel Berger, the Craighead Professor of Wildlife Biology, will be talking about snow oxen and big animals in an increasingly peopled world. And that's on December 2nd. That one will occur. And I'd like to find a place for a couple more people to sit down, but anyway, we've got a pretty full house. There may be a seat every so often. If people could raise their hand and just maybe show other people where there's a seat, we can get a couple people. If you would like to move forward, you can. Otherwise, don't move. We'll let the president have a seat in one of those. Okay, good, thank you. So anyway, those are two other talks that will be coming up during this year of faculty members that have done marvelous things, but tonight we have another faculty member that continues to do marvelous things. And to introduce our speaker tonight, I'm asking Dean Chris Comer to come forward and just say a few words.
Well, good evening. It's great to see an SRO crowd for an event like this. These are the nights that make it wonderful to be in a college like Humanities and Sciences when you come out to hear our own stars, somebody that we value in our community. Let me tell you a little bit about Joanna. She's really a model for us in many ways because she's so wonderfully trained. We always exhort our students to get a great broad training. Hers is pretty fantastic. She got her undergraduate degree from Carleton College, and it was in philosophy and literature. And she then moved to Johns Hopkins University, and she got a degree in German literature. Then she got her MFA from the University of Iowa, and then she finished off with a PhD from Johns Hopkins again in the humanities. So she's got a wonderful humanistic training. She's been a working poet in addition to being a faculty member, and that obviously requires juggling lots of unique talents across one's life. She's published 4 books, lots of other things. I'm sure there's another one in the works, probably, right? She's had numerous residencies and awards. She's had fellowships and residencies that have extended to France, to Italy. For 2 years, she was the Briggs Copeland Poet at Harvard University. And last year, as Perry alluded to, she won one of the very prestigious Arts and Letters Awards from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. So it's really fitting that she's presenting tonight. I thought her title was fabulous, and I'm really looking forward to it. So please give a warm welcome to Professor Joanna Klink.
Thank you. Okay, can you hear me in the back? No? Really? Okay. Mark, can I get my water? Sorry, I have to get my thermos of water. So thank you. Thank you for coming out tonight. Thank you, Dean Comer. And I especially want to thank Provost Brown for the invitation to be a part of this whole series. I'd also quickly like to thank all of my colleagues in the English department for the support over all these years since I started teaching here as a visiting assistant professor in 2000. And also, very quickly, thanks to Karen Shalm, who is always helping me out in every possible way. So I was asked to combine a lecture with a reading, and I've never done this before. So my plan is to talk for about 25 minutes about poetry in general, and then I'll read some poems. And hopefully that will still leave 10 minutes at the end or so just for questions that you might have.
Are they your poems? Are they your poems?
Yes, I'll read my poems, yes. Okay, so I thought it might be useful. Do some of you guys want to come sit up front here? No? Okay. I was trying to think of what would be useful, and I thought, okay, I'll just speak very generally about poetry, and it might be in perilously broad strokes about what poetry is and what makes it unique as an art, and also why you should care about it. Specifically, I want to talk about what we're listening for when we listen to poems. When people ask me what I do and I reply that I'm a poet, they often respond by shaking their heads and saying that they wished they understood poetry. And I can't tell you how often I hear people say, I don't get it. So there seems to be some kind of consensus that poetry is difficult and that whatever it's trying to do is largely inscrutable. Alienation from poetry has been around for a long time, which is why whenever there has been poetry, there have also been defenses of poetry close by, protesting that you should care about it and that it actually is coherent, that it's doing important cultural work, this kind of thing. And I suppose that what I'm about to say to you is also in defense of this genre that I love so much. So what I want to suggest to you tonight is that poems don't have to make sense. They don't have to make sense. That you are in a better position to hear and receive a poem if you are freed from feeling that you have to know what it means. So the first thing to keep in mind is that poetic language is unnatural language. It is highly artificial speech that explicitly distinguishes itself from ordinary speech. Poetry's commitment to saying certain things indirectly or obliquely, like Emily Dickinson has this very famous dictum, which is, tell the truth, but tell it slant. So the commitment to indirection. Also, poetry's extreme compression, because unlike other languages, I suppose I should say unlike prose, it's compressed by the right margin. So that right margin shapes the line, marks the end of the line. It's indirection, it's compression, and it's privileging of word and image and sound over story. All of these things create a strange language, a language that makes demands of anyone who encounters it. Now, our ordinary speech is efficient. In daily conversation or in lectures like the one I'm giving now, or when we're reading textbooks or news, we rely on language to swiftly communicate information. We say things, and it makes sense why we do this, we say things in the most efficient and direct way possible so that we can quickly understand and interact with each other. In effect, we rely on efficient speech in order to engage with each other every day, in order to function, and in order to sustain relationships, really, with one another. Now, efficient language makes relatively few demands on us as listeners and readers. Efficient speech doesn't require that we feel anything in order to make sense of it. So if you think about, for example, the language of journalism, that's deliberately gutted of its emotional registers for a reason. Efficient language doesn't require that we spend too much time processing what is meant. In fact, if you are writing a short paper for a class or a brief for a meeting and you digress too much, or you don't make sense, or you take too long to get to your point, or if you don't have a point, you have done a bad job. You have broken the contract of efficient speech. Poems, on the other hand, assume that much of our experience is inefficient and tremendously complex, that our experiences in life are overloaded with thoughts and feelings, many of them precise and contradictory and overwhelming, that the impact of these experiences unfold only gradually in our awareness, and mostly sideways at weird angles and bursts, and that our lives and ourselves are strange. Poems want to express what it feels like to be inside a body and a mind and to undergo a moment in life. And to do this, they deliberately mess with the circuit of efficient communication. They deliberately mess with it. And I think a great deal of the frustration with poetry comes from the fact that it takes something that we rely on every second of every day for meaning and for relationship, efficient speech, and it torques it. Poems insist that you have a different relationship to language in order to partake in them. And this is not the case with any other art form. When you're in front of a painting, for example, the encounter is completely freed from language. So you give yourself over to colors and shapes, maybe pictures spread out across the canvas. Or with a sculpture, you give yourself over to stone or wire or wood, a thing that's shaping the space around it. And in each case, the materials set the terms. So you have no choice but to figure out how to interact with what's on the canvas, what's around the wood, and the mysteries of presence that they create. In contrast, the materials of a poem are entirely language. And to my mind, the real problem is that these materials are too recognizable. They're too familiar. We hear words and we think, oh, words. It's a signal to our brains that we should be able to grasp more or less what is meant. But in order to receive a poem, you have to undo your habits of expectation for meaning in language. So you have to keep one foot perched in familiar speech, information-driven, direct, and efficient speech, and one foot perched in speech which is just pure digression or pure dream. And frequently enough, straddling worlds in this way, poetry becomes a language which is bordering on nonsense. And as a result, the so-called message of a poem is always partially obscured. It's always sort of far off and strange. And this isn't true of fiction and nonfiction and drama. No doubt, these genres have their own magnificent ways of shaping mystery, but their main focus is not on pushing language to the point where it becomes a different order of language altogether. So that's really the issue here. Pushing language to the point where it becomes a different order of language altogether, or to the point where it becomes music. So just to give you an example, here is the opening of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poem called The Windhover, which is about an experience the poet had when he spotted a falcon in the sky. So the opening lines are, "I caught this morning morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dapple dawn-drawn falcon in his riding of the rolling, level, steady underneath him air." I think I screwed up the syntax on that. Let's see. Dapple dawn-drawn falcon in his riding, this is it, in his riding of the rolling, level underneath him steady air. And so you can see how this comes kind of close to nonsense. And that's because you feel the sound first and the content second. So it takes a while for the mind to catch up to what's happening in the bird's royal flight, how the falcon is riding the currents as if they were steady air underneath it, drawing dawn forth as it goes. And you could, with most moments like that, which are syntactically complex, you can unravel them and put them in the proper grammatical order. And so what you're really doing is you're feeling the proper order of grammar, and then you're feeling the way it gets scrambled, and you feel both things at once. Poems are poised between speech and music. The literary critic Northrop Frye has written about the origins of the lyric in charms and incantations. And indeed, when poems are good, they can resemble spells. Their sound power makes them hypnotic. And most poems are held together by some kind of sound pattern: rhyme, rhythm, punning, repetition. There's always a kind of sound linking that blurs in and out of sense. And most of this is happening below the threshold of our analytic mind, which wants to make connections between things explicit. So if we suspend the mind's intelligence and allow room for the intelligence of the ear, we get closer to the quiet force of poetry. As Frye says, the hypnotic incantation of poetry, quote, appeals to involuntary physical response, and hence is not far from a sense of magic or physically compelling power. When you listen to a piece of music and you put yourself into a state of receptivity, you allow yourself to be absorbed in the sound and the rhythm, and really, most of you probably don't think twice about it when you're listening to a song. You rarely hear people say that they don't get a song, that they don't understand a song. They might say that they were moved by it or not, or try to explain how they felt in its presence. But generally, people feel freed from the obligation to make sense of music, and that's because the focus is not on the language. But you will hear people say that they don't understand certain lyrics. And that's because the efficiency of speech in strange lyrics is put to a different use. So if you treat poems as music, you will be freed into having the experience of being inside them, not outside them. You are inside a good poem. You have the experience in your body, in your ears, with all of your senses, in your heart, in your lungs, and not exclusively in your mind. And I think when it's over, you can expect to somehow be changed by it. I should also say that poems are really meant to be read aloud, and they're meant to be read aloud by you, not by somebody else. You are meant to voice the strange words on the page so that they become your speech. There is perhaps something fishy and secondary about poetry readings, where a poet stands in front of an audience and reads her work. You will have the best experience of a poem if you voice it, if you read it over and over to yourself, or if you commit it to memory, if you turn it over in your head day by day and month by month. If the poem is a good poem, and if it speaks to you, it enters you slowly over time, in a liquid way, like a dream, and then it stays with you. Another defining quality of poetry is that it carries a higher degree of patterning than ordinary language. So at the most basic level, a poem is just a pattern of stresses. And I know this is going to sound obvious, but stress is value. When you mark a stress with your voice, you're marking a word that has value. A word, it has, in relative terms, it's more important than the other words that are around it. So it takes a stress, it's emphasized, it has worth. So just to give you an example of this, this is a passage from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Eliot, and you can listen to the stresses. And indeed, there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. So the word time takes a stress, and so does smoke and slides and face. And these words are more crucial than the other words. And so we instinctively start to connect them and search for meaning between those connections. That doesn't mean that we have to know immediately what it all amounts to, but just we take the words that are given a stress and start to sort of put them together in our heads. And this also happens with rhyme. That's just another example of it. These words knit together a sense of sort of endless, reassuring possibility. Just, there will be time, there will be time. There's a hint that time is sliding and lingering and distorting for the yellow smoke that slides across the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. And a suggestion that being able to face other people is slow and sometimes an agonizing struggle, to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. Poetic language is constantly calling attention to the stressing of words. It is a kind of rhythmic code that conveys what is most valuable to the poet. And indeed, poetry leans on every expressive technique that it has, diction and syntax, image, modulations of voice, everything, to give you a sense of what matters, to body it forth in sound. And entire value systems are made audible and visible in every line. And the ways that poetry does this is just extremely sophisticated. I'll just give you an example. You may have been taught in English classes about the distinction between traditional poetic language and modern poetic language, which is a distinction between poetry and form, where the form is it's given to you or given to the poet before the poet sits down to write. So, for example, with a villanelle, you know how the lines repeat and you know what the stanzas or the stanzaic shape is supposed to look like. And on the other hand, modern poetic language, which is free verse poetry, where form is discovered in the act of composition, where the poet finds the pattern as he writes. So if you just think about traditional metrical poems just for a second, you can see already that there's a complex tension between the metrical baseline and then the human speech that happens on top of that. It breaks with the baseline. So the sonnet form tells us, okay, 14 lines of iambic pentameter. The rhymes go here and the stresses go here. But if you've ever written a sonnet, you know that you are fighting that form. You throw yourself against the form. You create a new pattern by struggling against the one that's given to you. So when we hear a good line in a sonnet, we're hearing both at once. We're hearing the ghostly whale shape of the fixed pattern underneath, and then the music of a specific human voice pulling against that. And this is probably the most prominent example of how poems use patterning to heap up several elements at once, to make you feel several different, disparate things at once. Beyond the sound patterns and patterns of stresses, there's also visual patterning, just the way the poem is laid out across the page. And there's breath patterning because the stresses are telling you where to pause and where to breathe. So, what are we listening for in the midst of all this music-driven, stress and pattern-driven, overloaded speech? We're listening for a human sound, what Wallace Stevens has called the cry of the poem's occasion, an intimate texture of what it feels like to be alive, to be in grief or in love or at war with oneself, to be inside a body and a mind that has an extraordinary capacity to feel. Poems carry emotions, but they don't just do that. They carry emotions and judgments and ideas and memories and impressions, all tangled beautifully and mercilessly into one another. If you let go of that part of your brain that needs to get and quickly assimilate information, that wants what the British psychoanalyst Adam Phillips has called states of conviction, if you let go of those states of conviction, you will be flooded by other powerful states, many of which are difficult to express in any clean and direct way. And this doesn't happen continuously as you listen to a poem or as you read a poem. You sort of drift in and out of states of feeling and understanding. Poems ask that you feel something in the absence of complete understanding. When you first hear or read a poem, you are unlikely to understand it. And although, if it's a good poem, you will feel things. After you've spent a great deal of time with it and lived with it, you may be able to say that you understand, but you probably won't be able to summarize what it means. The best poems convey entire worlds of passions and thoughts, and these can't be conveyed in any other way than by the poem itself. So if you can paraphrase a poem or say what it's about, if you can explain its message, something is wrong. Adam Phillips quotes John Ashbery as having said, "The worse your art is, the easier it is to talk about." And I should add that most poets write poems precisely because they want to express something that they can't name or say directly. One of my favorite fiction writers, Donald Barthelme, has written in an essay from 1987 called Not Knowing. He's written that, quote, "Art is not difficult because it wishes to be difficult, but because it wishes to be art. However much the writer might long to be in his work simple, honest, and straightforward, these virtues are no longer available to him. He discovers that being simple, honest, and straightforward, that in doing that, nothing much happens. He speaks the speakable, or that's what I would call the familiar, whereas what we are looking for is the as yet unspeakable, the as yet unspoken. Poets want to capture something that is beyond what they have language for, beyond familiar explanations, beyond visible surfaces, beyond their own intuitions even. They don't always know any more than you do what it all means. And I can speak from experience, having taught workshops here for many, many years, that a lot of times we read poems and we just think, wow, what does that mean? We don't know. You write something and you simply don't know. The freedom to dwell in states that don't make proper sense, the freedom to break from certain rules and conventions and establish meanings, the freedom to mess with words and to create dream worlds, half recognizable and charged with vision and light. These are all part of the reason people are drawn to write poems and to read poems and to listen to poems. Poems want you to have an experience. They want you to undergo something, but at a different level than in ordinary waking life. They want you to linger a while in the unknown, the unresolved, with its patterns and realizations not yet come clear, with what is gorgeous and terrible and playful all laid over one another. So for a moment, they ask you to feel life more intensely. In closing, I just want to mention Adam Phillips' essay called On Not Getting It, which is from his recent book, Missing Out. Phillips points out that we have been educated to think of language and of people as something we can get. And he makes this lovely analogy between the experience of listening to poems and the experience as a child, which is both pleasurable and frustrating, of not getting what adults are talking about, of listening to voices without understanding what they are saying. And this goes to the heart of poetic language, to John Stuart Mill's canonical definition of lyric speech as overheard speech. Phillips says this, quote, "When Ashbery was asked in an interview why his poetry was so difficult, he replied that when you talk to other people, they eventually lose interest, but that when you talk to yourself, people want to listen." What Ashbery is suggesting is that the wish to communicate estranges people from one another. If you talk to people, he suggests, they lose interest. If you ignore them, or rather, if you ignore them by talking to yourself, they are engaged. Now, Phillips is trying to make us appreciate ways in which listening in or overhearing might be preferred to communication and comprehension. And I wonder what it would be like if we brought that same patient curiosity and willingness to listen to be held in the grip of unknowing, not just with poems, but with other people. What if human interactions were not solely based on the need to quickly get each other, but to stay with each other through confusion and disarray? If you don't require immediate intelligibility, what are you freed up to feel? Or, as Phillips puts it, in which areas of our lives does not knowing, not getting it, give us more life rather than more deadness? Poetry lets us drop into another sense of time so that we can feel other ways of knowing, so that we can keep alive the slow shape of understanding, so that the energies of the mind are made deeper and more nuanced precisely because they are overloaded. In this way, poetry offers us a model for ways of being in the world that require our participation more than our understanding. Pablo Neruda concludes his great poem, The Art of Poetry, with these lines, and they're lines that remind us that in the midst of tremendous feeling, there might not be a message. This is Neruda. Still, the truth is, the wind suddenly hitting my chest, the nights with infinite substance fallen into my bedroom, the crackling of a day hardly able to burn, ask from me, sadly, whatever I have that is prophetic. And there are objects that knock and are never answered, and something always moving, and a name that does not come clear. Okay, so now I'm going to shift gears. And I'm going to read two long poems, and then they're not that long. And then I'll open things up for questions, and hopefully we can talk about some of these issues. So the first poem I'm going to read is from my most recent book, Raptus. And that book is about the dissolution of a relationship and its aftermath. And there are also a number of poems in the book about the Iraq War, which was that was sort of unfolding in this very surreal way at the same time that I was writing these poems. And like many Americans, I watched the lead up to the invasion of Iraq and what followed in those years with a lot of horror. And I had been thinking about the whole phenomenon of being carried away by strong emotions. So the title of my book, Raptus, it means a fit of intense emotion, and it comes from actual medical terminology. You have a raptus of the bones or raptus of the blood, a physical seizure of emotion that can carry you away suddenly and fitfully, or carry you away from yourself. So when I wrote this poem, I was thinking about the need to pull oneself back from extreme states. Let's see here. So this is called The Radiant. What fell to the earth fell quickly, flew into the forest with its lichen and salt. A flick of the conscience, the night tides hardly stirred. Something that came from far within and far off, in the lake beds, in the vegetable beds. It was enough to loosen the bones of the moon. I was living here and you were living here. We had everything we needed. At certain hours of the day, there were clouds in the leaves. Shelves of minerals, limestones, gravestones, redstones pitched by tides. Through the ground smoke and tree smoke, it was enough to lie on the bed, and it was enough to open our hands from the wrist and feel the gorgeous debris of ourselves, the far-off drone of plains, that softest patch on the skull. Skull skin, sea skin, skin of night, skin of grass. And the whales having traveled thousands of miles, and the elephant seals and the monarch flexing just now on the stem. No matter what they tell you, something fell to the earth, and the fire was blown sideways, and each insect stopped. It was enough to get inside us and our fat blue lakes and our dropsical features, our eyes turning in their sockets like cool private gems. Ice gems, ruby gems, gems of clay, gems of bone. The hills came down and the kelp forests swayed, and we were rich, were warm-blooded. And the civilians took refuge in the shed flint, the sand, deliriums of quiet, as if nothing had happened. And they said, nothing has happened. And the air touched the wicks. There were people. They all had names. We wrote stories on the door, and I wrote poems on the door, and it seemed as if we had taken each measure against harm, against sleep. And when the rain finished, the deserts shone like mirrors, and you reached for me in the blazing dark. Who were we then? On the box spring, in the wellspring, spring of blood, spring of night. No one to give our position away. Far within and far off, a small pain grew into quiet, the color of the many colors of flesh. Flesh heap, wind heap, heap of sand, heap of night. When it is enough, we will bear it. When it is enough, the dust fields will bloom. The sun's circadian trail will leave lines on the ground, and when it is enough, we will crawl there. Seasons, winds, moving along those sinews of dirt, root knots and tendons. It will be enough, they say. No matter what, nothing has changed. They all had names, and those names are passing through us. Hair clips and sweaters, shoelaces and charms. Raw quiet, bird quiet, beaks and fine bones, and you will not be released from the dream whose permanence is unease. So that every story you tell from now on must include it, and every body you love from now on must include it. No matter what they tell you, you know something has changed. Everything that never happened, everything that's now going so well. Like a square of light on the sea that held its force, then dissolved. Moon bromide, dusk bromide, fish, soothing night. And the trusses on the bridge will include it, and the coastal scrub will include it. Tides of sunlight, delicate metals, tobacco, and glue. And we'll drive to work and drive home, sleepy, relieved, with that dark, dry silence in us, so that beyond all hindsight and guesswork, it will reach back and touch the first breath of the first animal, and it will reach forward to touch the fogs that have not yet formed. And on the sea charts, we'll mark it, the skin charts, the screens, all sutures and visitations. People like ourselves who at certain hours of the day take refuge in coffee, cool interiors, in sheets, the day sleep, the night sleep, sleep of fire, sleep of grass. We are homesick. We are sense-clipped, but what can we do? We have brought ourselves here, and now must bring ourselves back. They were people first. This one, that one, had children, laughed at supper, spoke sharply, felt fear. And at dusk, the boys played soccer, something far within and far off, and if I knew their names, I could not live. And if I saw it in person, I could not live. And the close hours, the oversweetness, it would all be for naught. Day silks, blue silks, silks of waves, silks of night. And to act means to act again and again. And if you're lucky, your life will be free of such grief as touches those who light the first candle of evening in Baghdad. Fire swell, fire braid, braid of skin, braid of night. And if you're lucky, you will still be undone by light snow. And if you're lucky, you'll know what to do. I don't know what to do. So that no matter what they call it, you will respond to it. They were people first, like us, growing in beauty at the end of the day. And when the truth appears, it will be strange, and the fountains will rise, and the gorges will stall, the redwoods, the anchors, the fissures, the deeps, heart flint, wood sorrel, woodlark, so that what is desired is also possible, far within and far off, along the train tracks and dream tracks, the portals, the tides, so that when it is enough, the sky will scatter. When it is enough, men will see stars. Okay, I'm just going to read one more poem, and it's not as long. This last poem is from my new book, which is coming out in April. And the only thing you need to know is that this poem begins with my life in graduate school in Baltimore, which I hated. I hated Baltimore, and as many of you know, being in graduate school is terrible. So it starts there, and then it ends in Missoula, and you'll be able to identify Missoula whenever I say, out here, out here. And along the way, there are allusions to different cities where I lived and studied, like Boston and New York. The poem is broken into sections, so you'll hear me pause between the sections. This is called Excerpts from a Secret Prophecy. No one knew how to live there. Merciless mid-Atlantic heat, grime on the hot car windows, and trash heaps along schoolyards. We went to neighborhood markets for collards. Saturday, the humidity at 9 a.m. already unbearable, in grooves down our cheeks. Rough trust that we wouldn't have to stay and make a home there. Never a grand city at night, where blue-suited evenings you could stand on the sidewalk and look in. Windows fire-bled so that figures at meals seemed to rise in gray radiance. Who looks inside says less and less. The years abandoning their force, I remember black shades of red wine, the books I could barely afford, twice a day to the library, homeless men asleep by its pillars, afternoon rains in Baltimore, dark blue against the energy at work in my head. And so often in the afternoons, I have felt this strange mental life, curving, separate, as if my blood were iron, the storms arriving in patterns of lush thunder, a cool spray spun back from the grass. Once I lived throatless, believed that holding back sorrow would make sorrow soften. So easy to place an X over who you were. The soil under rain, now the fire's shifting plates beneath this wet cement. And if I have hoped for more, it is only the whole of loneliness, swept away by understanding. Who were you then, wanting to learn, reading all day, all night, fall in a strange city year after year? No one knew what to tell me. Keep studying. Through the bay window, sirens, and the silences that followed. Snow blurring down to the sick city trees. Walking to campus, hi, hello. The women in Italian boots for seminars. 4 hours later at the crosswalk, you saw no one you knew. You greet each person on the street, and the dark civilization of wind slams through you. No one knew what was coming. Miscarriage, divorce, disease. The country at war. Air brightening and darkening around the notebooks I hauled wherever I went. Was I meant to understand then how little I would matter to the future? I spent winters, summers trying to see. Driving out to the horse farms, poplars lining the road, pools of sunlight sinking into fields, the air darkening. How long can you wait? Your body crowded over with clouds and grasses, whole childhoods of grain blown back and forth inside your eyes. I waited a long time to find you, late in my life, homesick for nothing I could recognize. Another winter in an eastern city, iron grates dusting over with snow, quiet cells at night undetected, forgettable by dawn. Still, I watched you place your hand against the window's ice-burned sheet and trace wet stars that rose in ghostly lines during the city's night-slowed snowfall, warehouses leaping to your touch, roughed in brick. Your eyes, everything worth striving for, to be what you saw. There were times with you, burning through skin, marrow, shadow, night after night, what you brought to my body when we agreed on silence. I never imagined such closeness. Despite the terrible predictions, we drove to the coast, -10, and the beach was frozen, pressed transparent ice against our eyes. And nobody stood with us, troubled by the ocean materials, oily debris, carcasses of sea fish languishing frozen by the iced seawood. A kind of tundra we crossed as though, had we kept moving, a creature might simply turn alive. The gulls huddling in their slicked wings for heat, our lungs draining and filling with ice air. And the wide stillness where the gull cries should have been. Place an X over who you were, it doesn't help. Shut your eyes, there are abrasions beneath the eyelids. Coming to understand the ones you most love will die. Out here, I can feel the weight of the sky, the evening turning black its arid grasses. You changed who I was. Around you, I felt the need for pattern, a physical need to bring the hard light of the stars inside. It never worked. Under this moon, the mountains ripple in moth thinness. They would be crushed if you touched them. And the old oaks bracing the street, the theater whose placard is half-stitched by frost, are nerve endings where the sting of being alive can't stay captured. Night watcher, pillar, winter's past, iridescent ice filming on the lake, the water caught in merciful shades of white. The lines were cut deeply by skaters. I move the words in my head, trying to say what it has meant. So much yours, I hardly saw what was happening to me. Give yourself like that, and you are sure to lose something. Holding up all the beams of a life, you paced along bookshelves, smoked constantly, nicotine arching through the cranial vault, the same one splendid with thoughts. Some days whitening to disarray, who looks inside says less and less. I felt, below the blue-brown seasons of snow, the desiccated grooves of branches, something shift. My love leaving you. Spring, pre-spring, an increase in pests and parasites, plants blooming too early. I let it fall apart, and when it did, couldn't understand what was being asked of me. Spring rains, refilling the aquifer all summer, alone again. Orange cat sprawled across the dictionary, standing at the window night after night, remembering the prairies where I was born under deep lakes of cloud. It didn't help. Nothing helped. No one knew what to tell me. Keep living. How long can I wait? What I say today and what I say tomorrow perish equally. I loved you, but have already forgotten how it felt. Perhaps a joy that came in droves. Out here, you can hear everything at night. A dog in the distance calling out for company, someone slamming a door. Just to stay and not be drawn forward. Light in the afternoons, slowly sailing into pines. I have tried to be both open and among, and find myself always moored by inner anchors. But most hopes are private and flicker between burdens we can't share. Perhaps, like the wooden reins that drop across this valley, you are drawn to stillness. Perhaps, like me, you are clearing a space inside you, a floor where everything might spill. The clouds above these ridges show no hint of any cause. Night falls again. We river into one another, not understanding how much debt we owe to those we pass on the street. Like you, I would have done things differently, would have held on longer. The world breaks, is always breaking. Our bodies bear tremendous sorrow, and still, we stay as long as we can. Thank you.
Well, if somebody has a question or two, she's going to stay right there for a moment.
I will answer
We
questions.
need to move on out, but anybody have a question? Please, for a comment? Or just
Yes.
more thank yous? You go right there.
Not so much a question as a comment.
Yeah.
A little personal, but I just have to say
Yeah.
thank you so much. Because as a poet and a writer, my voice has been silent until tonight.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
So
Thank you for saying that. I think it's very strange business to be reading very personal poems aloud. Most poems are very personal poems, and that's why a lot of poets hide from poetry readings and would rather talk about poetry in general.
Anything else? Well, she'll be around for a few minutes too. So let's just thank her again. Just a wonderful evening.
Thank you.